Hi, friends. Welcome back to Igniting Imagination. I'm your host, Lisa Greenwood, and we are continuing this powerful season featuring our newest class of Locke Innovative Leaders. Each of these leaders is expanding the church's imagination, not just about what ministry looks like, but about what faithfulness requires in this moment. And I'm grateful to be joined again by my co-host, Dr. Aaron Kuecker. Aaron serves as CEO of Hope Chicago, an ambitious economic mobility initiative working to remove barriers to post-secondary success for 2 generations of families. He spent much of his leadership helping institutions rethink systems, from higher education to economic access, in ways that increase dignity and long-term flourishing. Aaron, it's always good to be in these conversations with you.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, what a pleasure to be here today.
So, Aaron, throughout your work, you've helped organizations move beyond surface level solutions toward deeper systemic change. So, when you think about the role of the church in confronting systemic injustice, what responsibility do you believe faith communities carry?
Yeah, well, we are invited by Jesus into a different way of being. And that invitation is both a gift and a calling. And I think for congregations or for communities to think about the ways that their patterns of life can extend the flourishing of every person that's connected, and that's a gift to be received. But more than that, it's a calling to turn that outward and offer whatever we have, whatever privilege, power, possessions, to turn that outward so that everyone around us, with whom our own flourishing is bound up, can also flourish in more and deeper ways as God intended for us. I think that's our responsibility, but it's a joyful responsibility. It's not a grit your teeth and do it. It's a let's build this world anew kind of responsibility.
Yeah, these themes of responsibility and how we show up in the world brings us to our guest today. We are honored to welcome Reverend Dr. Nikia Smith Robert, founder and executive director of Abolitionist Sanctuary. Dr. Nikia is an ordained elder in the AME Church, a womanist theologian, and an assistant professor of ethics and social justice at the University of Kansas. She holds both an MDiv and a PhD, and she brings together scholarship, public advocacy, and pastoral leadership in remarkable ways. You'll hear it in our conversation. Through Abolitionist Sanctuary, she has built a national coalition of Black-serving churches, civic organizations, and community leaders united around confronting mass incarceration and the criminalization of impoverished Black motherhood. Out of this work, she created the Abolitionist Academy, equipping congregations to lead with justice, courage, and theological clarity. Her leadership is both prophetic and pastoral, rooted in Black religious traditions, grounded in scholarship, and deeply invested in communities too often overlooked or harmed by systems of power. So, Aaron, before we move into the conversation, I'd love to hear what stood out for you.
Well, that conversation was full of sentences that I want to remember and live. Actually, but I think one of the things I was so struck by in Dr. Nikia's presentation today was the way that the work of repair, of taking things apart, of undoing structures that are hurting people, is always for the sake of the work of rebuilding. She used a sentence. She said, to create this world that we deserve. And I think I heard in that such an expression of the belovedness of all people by God, in this invitation to not just say no to things, but to say no so that we can build a world otherwise. I was so struck by that. Lisa, what about you? What did you hear in this today?
So one of the things that stood out to me is that there's a conviction about how we do anything is how we do everything, that how we live our daily lives, the choices we make, the things we stand up for are matter for the living out of the deeper conviction of what it means to be a Christian today and what it means to be the church today. And so We hear it in the process they've created to help churches live into that I think embodies the principles they're trying to teach. And I heard that you'll hear it as she talks about the work with churches.
Mm.
Dr. Nikia, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yes.
I'm so looking forward to this conversation, and I want to jump right in. And we're going to start with a bit of your origin story for Abolitionist Sanctuary in particular. I know from our conversations that it is deeply personal and rooted in your mother's story and your own lived experience. And so would you share for our listeners a bit of your family story to the extent that you're comfortable that has shaped your theology and your call and kind of those key moments for Abolitionist Sanctuary?
Sure. Thank you for that question, Lisa. Abolitionist Sanctuary has more than one starting point. It initially started as a dissertation. Michelle Alexander was a reader on my committee, the author of The New Jim Crow. And when she read about the intervention Abolitionist Sanctuary, she said, I would much rather help you fund this idea for it to sit on the journal page that no one ever reads. And so within 6 months of earning the PhD, I launched Abolitionist Sanctuary as a nonprofit organization. But it's also rooted in personal story, as you mentioned. As a dissertation student, a former student of Dr. James H. Cone, the father of Black liberation theology, I had began thinking about the theological underpinnings of mass incarceration at a time when people weren't really writing about it and it was still highly stigmatized and it predated the New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander's book. So mass incarceration from the perspective of the church hadn't yet entered into this national discourse. And so I organically began to research it, sitting in a Christology course with Dr. Cone, looking at first century crucifixions. And I remember with all fear raising my hand in his class and saying, is it possible that there's a connection between the first century crucifixion and the scapegoating of Black and brown bodies to mass incarceration today?
Mm.
And with that question in his Christology course, I turned it into a research project, which became my master's thesis titled Penitence, Plantation, and the Penitentiary, a Liberation Theology for Lockdown America. It was later published in the Harvard Graduate Journal. But when I arrived to doctoral studies under a womanist scholar, Monica A. Coleman, she challenged my thinking, which ultimately shifted my theology away from Black liberation theology sources to starting with the experiences of Black women.
Wow.
And I began to search my own life, and I thought about my mom, a poor single Black mother who sometimes bent rules and broke the law to provide for her family against unjust systems. Sometimes that meant forging a doctor's note to get a day off of work during an inconvenient school holiday when she could not afford child backup care. The alternative was letting me go home by myself. I would have to pass 2 public housing developments, a drug house, corner boys, gangs, just to arrive home. And then have to sit in my courtyard. We did not have greenery and, the safety of a suburban area, so to speak. And so I would sit on the monkey bars. And on this one day, I sat waiting for my mom because she couldn't get home from work in time. And there was a burglary at the video store across the street. And in pursuit by the police, the perpetrator ran through my apartment complex and something slid across the concrete at my feet. It was a gun and bullets. At that time, I thought it was batteries. It wasn't until just a few years ago I thought about it. It was like, it wasn't a toy gun. Those were in fact bullets. And so Black women who have limited options are often forced to negotiate the ways that they can make a way out of no way. And for my mother, it was either lying on that doctor's note or taking the risk of me waiting for her and encountering these death-dealing circumstances. And so the right thing to do for her was to commit forgery in this sense. And in my view, it didn't make her a bad person. It in fact revealed some positive qualities such as resilience, ingenuity, courage. And so I wanted to think about how can we reappraise poor Black mother survival strategies and shift away from individual blame to structural accountability, the systems that make survival nearly impossible in the first place. And that's the work that we do with Abolitionist Sanctuary in shifting those narratives and leading mutual aid campaigns to help Black mothers meet their basic needs, and also the training, the reconditioning, so that we're no longer punishing people for merely trying to survive.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. Dr. Nikia, that is like a rich wellspring from which to draw out this work. Theological, the community of the academy, your own story, your mother's strength. For people who are hearing about Abolitionist Sanctuary for the first time, how would you give an introductory description to what it is and what you do?
Sure. So, Abolitionist Sanctuary is leading this national coalition to train Black serving churches, civic organizations, and educational institutions to unite against the moral crisis of mass incarceration and the criminalization of impoverished Black motherhood. Our theory of change is rooted in the alliteration of three R's. I'm a preacher, so we like alliterations. And the three R's are to repair harms, restore relationships, and rebuild more just and equitable systems for communal flourishing beyond punishment, beyond poverty, beyond policing, and beyond prisons. The way we achieve that is through this narrative shifting, through the mutual aid and providing direct assistance, but also through trainings. And so I innovated Abolition Academy, where I constructed courses and certification programs that Black churches, civic organizations, and educational institutions can take or license in order to develop the strategies to build sanctuary.
And what does sanctuary look like? As you describe that, what does it look like as churches or nonprofits lean into this work?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. Sanctuary really is those three R's, right? It's the reparative work. How do we engage in the deconstruction to redress harmful theologies, teachings, and practices? It is also the constructive work, which is the restoration, R. And so, how do we replace those harmful theologies with emancipatory solutions, strategies, outcomes? And then it's also systems work, right? How do we design new infrastructure in this kind of transformative justice model? So the repair harms. First, we have to call out those harms, right? To restore relationships is how do we engage in the healing work and the harm reduction so that we could be in relationship with one another? And then how do we rebuild a more just and equitable system? That rebuilding is a transformative systems work, right? That we're moving from the individual level to ensuring that we're making structural change. So sanctuary, true sanctuary is providing refuge through building communities of care that adhere to those three R's, that embody those three R's.
Wow.
Well, I'm curious. Yeah, I am so curious to know. I mean, you shared some of the personal rootedness of that journey. I'm so curious to know if there was a moment when you knew this had to go from the right way of thinking to a new way of doing.
Yeah, we're living in a time where so much is at stake within our democracy, within our civil and human rights, that we no longer have the privilege to be complicit or to stay silent. Real lives hang in the balance. And so when I think about my upbringing, particularly growing up in the age of mass incarceration, but also the war against drugs, which was a war against Black people, the criminalization of poverty through welfare reform. I grew up in the same building as the Central Park Five. You may have seen the movie When They See Us with Ava DuVernay. Kevin Richardson was my next door neighbor. And some of the people I grew up with are still serving lifetime prison sentences without the possibility of parole. And so this hyper criminalization, mass incarceration, over policing is personal, right? And I see how every day it's affecting the real material lives of people. And to be honest, of all the people I've encountered, I'm not sure I've really encountered a bad person,
Mhm.
right? Those 5 boys who were falsely convicted, where Trump took out a one-page, full-size page in the New York Times calling for the death penalty, they weren't bad boys, right? In fact, they were facing a bad system. And so those moments make me realize that we don't have time to waste, right? When we see the rollback of our democracy and living under an authoritarian regime, where we see the rise of white Christian nationalism, where we see this false narrative of American exceptionalism, right? That it is a lot at stake and it is causing us our democracy, it is causing us our lives, it is causing us our civil and human rights. And so there's no time to wait, right? There's no time to drag our feet. The time is now.
Your ability to see what's happening and then to really face it in a way that helps people reframe and understand differently what they're seeing and experiencing is powerful, and it's convicting, and it's the basis I'm seeing of what you're doing here with Abolitionist Sanctuary. And I mean, these words that you used earlier when you talked about your mom and other impoverished Black mothers bend or even break the rules, the law. And yet what it's showing is resilience, courage, conviction, compassion for their families and their ability to survive. And I'm curious, as you do that reframing, as you invite people to face circumstances and name it differently, I'm curious what resistance you have encountered.
When I hear that question, the first thing that comes to mind is being a researcher at a level 1 research institution and writing about justifying poor Black mothers' lawbreaking and getting a phone call from my institution saying, we can't promote this, right?
Wow.
We cannot take on the risk or liability of subjecting ourselves to possible resistance or attack by publishing and advertising your scholarship. And so institutions have been a source of resistance. And so this is why Abolition Academy is so important, because we're building a space that provides an alternative that is invested in counter narratives to domination, right? And hegemonies. And so the Black church has always served as this alternative space, particularly for education. When we look at our Sunday school unions and you look at freedom schools and the hush harbors, when you look at the emergence of HBCUs and some early seminaries, they're coming from denominations, right? And education is a tool of resistance against the backlash, right? When you think about those who largely voted for Trump, it was largely white, uneducated voters. And so our investment in education is directly connected into our investment in building a better democracy. And so how do we build these alternative spaces that we're calling sanctuary so that when we are disallowed from teaching emancipatory outcomes and interventions and we face the resistance of institutions, that we could teach it anyway, and that we could teach it in a way that that factors in the life and death stakes, but also creates space to create something, to imagine something that's better than our current circumstance, right? And that creating, that imagining is theological, right? That's theological work.
Yeah.
And it's also the ethos of abolition. So yes, the resistance has been from institutions. And in response to that, we're creating an alternative space called Sanctuary through our Abolition Academy and our organization so that we can still do the work of liberation.
Yeah. It's powerful to think about how the Black church has been a place of that kind of education and resistance, and not just the Black church, but some movements,
Yes.
Hush Harbors and others. And I'm curious, and all of that kind of countercultural work, that resistance work has been risky
Yeah.
in our country.
Yeah.
And what feels risky right now for you in this?
Everything. Being Black, being woman, um, teaching critical race theory, identifying with pronouns, right? Everything is risky. Anything outside of white cis heteronormativity, right? And this is the methodology of building abolitionist sanctuaries. What society considers a vice, we consider a virtue, right? What society is saying, is wrong, we're saying actually it's right. Black mothers are onto something when they're breaking these unjust laws to provide for their families, right? They're teaching us how to upend the system that is designed and stacked up against them, right? And so the work that we do is countercultural, it's subversive, it's what Nietzsche called the transvaluation of values. It's the work that Jesus did when he turned social orders upside down, where the last would become first and the fools will shame the wise, where you'll be the lender and not the borrower, right? It is that radical reordering that we are doing to say, no, it's not that Black mothers are deviant because they're transgressing the boundaries of whiteness, right? No, that's not something to punish, right? But the work that we're doing is saying, actually, what they're showing us are not vices, but virtues, right? They're showing us that something about their survival practices and agency is pointing to the evils of a system that is not right, right? And so that is the work, that is the method of abolitionist sanctuary, is turning these unjust systems upside down, and it's reclaiming the worth and the desert of people on the underside who society would otherwise punish as transgressive and deviant because they're somehow, stepping outside the boundaries of white cis heteronormativity, right? White male middle class values.
I've heard a few times in what you shared, sort of two sides of a coin. You've spoken really powerfully about the need to take some things apart.
Yeah.
But you've never done that without talking about the need to build something or life-giving, life-affirming space. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about what you see emerging inside of communities or congregations that begin this journey of not just taking apart, but building a new kind of space. What happens to communities?
That's really powerful. So I don't think we hear enough of what churches are doing to create this world that we deserve. And I think we so easily become trapped in the cycle of criticism and deconstruction, and we don't move to how do we create and imagine something better. And that's the work of abolition, right? We learned that abolition isn't just a negative project, but it's also a positive one. It isn't just tearing down and dismantling, but it's also building something new. And that's why within our theory of change, that last R, the rebuilding, right, and even the restoration is the constructive move. And so this convening that we're having on April 11th in Washington, D.C. is titled Building Abolitionist Sanctuaries. And our vision for this gathering is to treat each participant as a knowledge expert. So it's not your typical gathering where you're speaking down to people, information is going one way from the speaker to the participants. But each person who enters into that space is bringing a context with them, right? And they are responding to some type of problem within their local community with solutions that we probably can all benefit from. So I was on a call with one pastor in Washington, D.C. on the outskirts. And he said that his church was a former gym. And each bathroom had 2 showers. And so he partnered with a nonprofit organization that provided mobile showers. And he surveyed his community and saw that there was a large houseless population. And so he used his sanctuary to provide showers to people who are living outside. Now, how many of us would think about using our sanctuary in that way? How many of us would open our doors to use sanctuary in that way? But when we can exchange ideas in community, we begin to see what's possible beyond our own imagination and context. And so that I think is what's so powerful about coalition and base building and the work that we're doing in building a national faith-based abolitionist movement.
I'd love for you to say more about coalition building and why that is so central, because it seems really built into the work that you're doing.
Yeah, because coalition counters neoliberal capitalist values of individualism and self-responsibility, right? Coalition counters everything that the machine tells us,
Mm.
right? And so how do we understand that we are all we need,
Mm.
right? I worked with a village in
Emphasis
Malawi.
on we, right?
Emphasis on we, which
Yeah,
which
yeah.
is also traced to an African ethics of Ubuntu,
Mhm,
right? In West
mhm,
Africa, I am because you are or we are, right? And I was working with a village in Malawi, the Othaka Harka Foundation, and the executive director there, Ida Puliwa, um, essentially used a mutual aid model to advance woman and girl empowerment in a patriarchal village of male chiefs.
mm,
And so essentially her story is um, a good Samaritan, which was her uncle at the time, paid for her to go to the university. At the middle of her studies, tragically, he dies in a car accident and no one could pay for her studies anymore. A professor in Michigan, I think it was University of Michigan, came to the village to teach, but she needed a translator. Ida was her translator. They built a connection, and this professor said, "I'll fund your studies so you could finish college."
wow.
So when Ida finishes her studies, she starts this nonprofit called Athaka Harka, which in her native tongue means paying kindness forward.
Mm,
And with that, she went to the chiefs in her village and she asked if she can help train the girls and the mothers. And they said no, because it was patriarchal, right? A girl can't do something like that. So what she did is she gathered a coalition. She built a mass within her village, and sacrificially, each person in her village who supported her was tasked with giving 7 cents, just 7 pennies. And they pooled their 7 pennies together and they were able to build agricultural systems, orphanages, education around HIV AIDS, right? Like they were able to build an economy around
mm,
mutual aid. And it made me think, what about the African diaspora? What about this ethics, this communal ethic can teach us how to build self-sustaining communities independent of government intervention, but the idea that we're all we need. And what we see in poor communities, and particularly Black communities, is that's what we always did. When a church mother had a crumbled dollar and she put it in your hand,
mm,
right? When you went to your neighbor and you asked for sugar because you needed to bake the cake and you ran out of it, right? That the resources we need are within our community. And if we were to just counter this neoliberal ethic of individualism that creates scarcity and competition to pit people against each other, and instead operate from cooperation and communal cooperative economics and this communal ethos, I mean, we could be so powerful, right? So powerful. And so Abolitionist Sanctuary is engaging in that coalition building through our mutual aid model. For example, we just responded to the crisis of the Eaton Canyon wildfires in Altadena that decimated a historically middle-class Black neighborhood in Altadena, California. And we used mutual aid to give mothers mortgage assistance. People who were displaced had to pay mortgage on a home that was burnt down to ashes and still pay rent. so that they could have a roof over their head while they're waiting to rebuild, right? This double hit. So we pooled resources together from the community. We were able to give mortgage assistance to support Black mothers. We were able to feed people. We were able to refer people to housing, right? And to be honest, this communal mutual aid model is also consistent with the Underground Railroad, right? And the church, many Black churches were a stop on the Underground Railroad. And so we still see this relationship between faith communities being sanctuaries, right, to provide refuge and hope for people who are left out of resources to survive. And so that coalition is essential work.
Yeah. We are the body of Christ,
We are
members
the
of it.
body of Christ. That's right. That's right. Absolutely.
I'm listening to that and thinking about how much I love the way that your method is itself a counter narrative. And I hear like so much Jesus inside of that,
Yeah.
these ways of being that are starkly other than. I hear that in what you're sharing. I'm wondering, we often think about like our action as being rooted in our teaching, but I'm wondering, like, as you invite people to that method, that way of being, that practice of communal care, the usness of it,
Yeah.
if you're noticing, like, what do people begin to see and understand more deeply, differently, or better about God's life? Like, how does the action welcome people into understanding who God is better?
Yeah. So I think a lot of people who rightfully push back on Christianity is because they were only given the Christianity of colonialism and conquest.
Yeah.
The understanding of Christianity connected to this Christian nationalism. But there's another Christianity, right? So there's the Christianity that is the that is the state religion of Constantine and the empire. And then there's a Jesus movement. Jesus, who is a revolutionary, Jesus, who I see as a first century abolitionist. How do I know this? When Jesus read from the scrolls of Isaiah in Luke 4:18 to announce his purpose, his mission statement, he said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me and has called me to preach good news to the poor and to set the captives free." Jesus essentially outlines a socialist vision to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, heal the brokenhearted, give drink to those who are thirsty, right? But also to set the captives free. When he gave the criteria of how we will be judged in Matthew 25, the criteria of discipleship, he said, "As often as you have done it for the least of these, you have done it for me." Well, done what? He said, "Have you visited me in prison?" Right? And so when we think about Christianity, it's thinking about Christianity um, as disciples and followers of Jesus, a brown Palestinian Jew who was arrested on trumped up charges, ethnically profiled because it predates race, right? Who died a deplorable criminal's death, hanged on a cross between two thieves by a state sanctioned execution, right? That this Jesus who identifies with the lowly and the oppressed is the Jesus that we are called to follow, who ultimately lived his life to overturn oppressive systems and the Roman Empire. And so that is seeing Christianity through the lens of not oppression, but liberation, right? That's a liberation theology, a social gospel. And even within Judeo-Christian texts, right, is understanding the prophetic tradition, right? The ways in which the prophets spoke up against injustices.
Yeah.
And so what I teach is this reconditioning that reorients people to understand the God of liberation and Jesus, who is a first century abolitionist. And God cared so much about the criminalized body that if we were to talk incarnational theology, that God broke into history through a criminalized brown Palestinian Jew, that God could have assumed the body of a king. God could have assumed the body of a politician, right? But God chose the body of Jesus, a brown Palestinian Jew who would be criminalized. And so this is the person I am okay with following, right? If that's what Christianity means, if it means setting the oppressed free and feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and giving drink to those who thirsty, sign me up for this, Jesus.
Yeah. Sign me up for this, Jesus. Most of our listeners are local church leaders, pastors, lay leaders, and if this is a new conversation for them, and if they're kind of dipping their toe in the water, if you will, what's a question that they might wrestle with their leadership team? What's an entry point into these conversations?
I mean, I think there's when we talked about resistance, I think there's a lot of pushback on abolition. How do we keep communities safe if we were to end policing in prisons? Right? I had a religious scholar push back on a presentation that I once gave, and she said, what does abolition say about justice if someone's car was stolen, or if a mother lost her child to gun violence? Who are we to say that they should not want that person to be prosecuted and incarcerated? And so some people will argue that some of the weakness to abolition is its theory of justice. Some people will argue to say that abolition isn't fair to people who encounter sexual and intercommunal violence. How do you keep someone safe from from someone who harms their body, right? They're rapists essentially, without police and prisons. And how I would open up the conversation to that is to say, abolition invites us to think about alternatives, right? That's rooted in accountability, right? And so when we participate in punishment, then we contribute or reproduce harm. But how can we think about alternatives that hold people accountable? That's the work of abolition. How do we repair the harms, restore the relationships, and rebuild sanctuary where people feel safe? And so I think, and then theologically, thinking about all the ways in which God was on the side of liberation, whether it was freeing Moses and the children of Israel, right? That God is a liberator, that Jesus is a first century abolitionist, that freedom is foundational to our Christian belief, right? For the truth shall set you free, right? Freedom means something, and the work of freedom is abolition. So it is both a moral mandate, but it's also a theological imperative.
I'm hearing over and over again that foundational to this work is both a curiosity and an interrogation of things that we have perhaps assumed to be just. And that kind of curiosity and interrogation, when it is grounded in the gospel, can lead us to ask new questions of maybe norms that we have accepted. And it strikes me that that is the work of the church.
Yeah.
If we are really going to be the counter narrative, as Brueggemann calls us to be, then we do have to interrogate what is the reigning culture, if you will, and that can take us to some scary places.
Yeah.
Scary for what we have deemed safe.
Yeah.
Especially if we're in the dominant culture, and that call I'm hearing loudly and clearly from you, Dr. Nikia, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to be clear, because we give concrete tools. That our organization has developed a model called 4 Churches, which is a 2x2 matrix that we can go in and help churches assess what type of church are they. Are they a condemnatory church? Are they a complicit church? Or are they a courageous church and a change-oriented church, right? And so that's the assessment model. And then we help give tools to move from those two left quadrants, condemnation and complicity, to the two right, courage, but ultimately change, right? We also look at reappraisals. We have what we call 5 C's, and we help churches and organizations adopt these 5 C's as their values. Those five C's being compassion, creativity, care, courage, and community, right? And we understand that those 5 virtues come out of the survival practices of Black mothers, and they teach us how to engage in ways that is counter-resistance, right? That is countercultural to carceral vices, right? So we have those 5 virtues, but the antithesis of them are the carceral vices that uphold systems of punishment. So not care, right? But negligence, not creativity, but conformity, not compassion, but condemnation, not courage, but cowardice, not community, but individualism, right? And so we help people to think about, how do we reappraise, right? How do we change our perspective of how we see people, not through the lens of condemnation, but through compassion, even if they're breaking law to provide for themselves. Why? Because it's not blaming individuals, but it's interrogating the structural systems, right? So we have our four churches, we have our 5 C's. We also have Abolition Academy, where congregations, participants can take courses, where they can engage in the training and the unlearning and relearning, to interrogate harmful theologies and to recondition more restorative and emancipatory church teachings and practices. We also have ways that churches and organizations can license our platform and offer their own trainings, right? So yeah, there's tools that we are giving. That repair, restore, rebuild is a theory of change. That's another tool. And so if there's anyone who wants to engage in the work of becoming sanctuaries and building sanctuaries, then I invite them to visit us at abolitionistsanctuary.org, but also abolitionacademy.com, where they can take the courses, they can learn about our organization, and then please meet us in Washington, D.C. on April 11th and learn in person with us in this coalition that we're building, a faith-based abolitionist movement.
That's great. That's great. Dr. Nikia, we'll put all those links in the show notes so that folks can access those. And I want to finish on a final question that we are asking all our guests this season. And that is, as you reflect on your leadership journey, what inner work, spiritual practices or habits or core convictions, what has mattered most in sustaining you for this kind of ministry?
Yeah. What matters most to me is an integrity to the movement, that it's not about me, it's not about personality, but it's about shifting systems and institutions and building the movement. And so taking on the spiritual practice of less of me and more of the work that we're doing to change the system and build something better. Another spiritual practice for me, besides church and Bible and so forth, is my family. I really, really love my family. I've married with 18 years with a wonderful partner and 3 beautiful children. And my first ministry is motherhood, and my family. And then also caring for my mental well-being and body, working out every day, napping. All of these are spiritual practice. I mean, Jesus napped. Jesus napped. And so all of those spiritual practices ground me.
Wonderful. Thank you for the work that you are doing. Thank you for spending time with us. And grateful for you.
I'm grateful for you guys. Thank you so much for this partnership.